Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about complex fractions. So what is a complex fraction, you ask? A complex fraction is when you have a fraction bar, and then above that fraction bar you have a fraction, and below that fraction bar you can have a fraction. So on the top there can be more than one fraction, and on the bottom there can be more than one fraction. But the definition of a complex fraction is when there is a fraction in which there is a fraction on top and a fraction on the bottom. So when we have a problem like this, how do we go about solving it? So the first thing I have for you is a list of steps along with an example so we can see how to use them. So let's switch to a highlighter so we'll be able to see what we're doing. So our first step is we want to create one fraction on top. So you notice on top I currently have two fractions, 1/2 and 1/4. I cannot combine those fractions because they do not have a common denominator. So I grab a common denominator, so the common denominator of 1/2 and 1/4 is fourths. And I change 1/2 into its equivalent fraction of 2/4. So now I create 2/4 minus 1/4. I can now do my math. So 2/4 minus 1/4 is 1/4. Okay, so top is done. Now that I have one fraction on top, I want to do the same to the bottom. So on the bottom I have 1/8 and 1/4. Just like on the top, I'm going to need to find a common denominator. So the common denominator of 8 and 4 is 8. So I change 1/4 into its equivalent fraction of 2/8. So now I have 1/8 plus 2/8. So I can add those. 1/8 plus 2/8 is 3/8. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. So now I just have 1/4 plus 3 divided by 3/8. 1/4 divided by 3/8. Now that I have that, I can write it in a form that's familiar to me. I know how to write it with a division symbol in between. So I'm going to take it out of the fraction bar and write it as 1/4 divided by 3/8. Now remember way back to when you learned how to divide fractions. We hate dividing fractions. They are so icky. So instead of dividing, we do keep, in which we keep the first fraction. We change, in which we change the division sign to multiplication. Let me get rid of this little mark here. And then we flip, in which we flip the second fraction upside down. By flipping the second fraction upside down, we're allowed to make this multiplication. And multiplication is so much easier. So now that we have it in a multiplication problem, all we have to do is have 1/4 times 8/3. So 1 times 8 was 8, and 4 times 3 was 12. So now we can simplify. So they divided each side by 4, divided by 4, divided by 4. And that got us 2/3. You can also simplify via cross simplification, and we'll do that in our examples today. So now that we've looked at the steps, let's actually put them to use. So in this first problem, it is complex because we have a fraction on top and then a number on the bottom. However, you notice that this one already has a couple steps done. So step 1 is to make sure there's only one fraction on top. Got that. Step 2 is to make sure there's only one fraction on the bottom. There's only a number on the bottom, so I got that. So now for step 3, we're going to rewrite this so it's more familiar. So we're going to write 1/3 divided by 7. You know, I'm not going to be able to really flip this number unless it looks like a fraction. So let's make 7 into a fraction by putting it 7/1. Now that I have that, I can keep my first number, change my division to a multiplication sign, and flip my 7/1 upside down. Okay. So now it's multiplication. Now I just solve. 1 times 1 is 1. 3 times 7 is 21. And there is nothing to simplify, so that is my final answer. Okay, I get it. That one was easy. So let's try a slightly more difficult example. So in this example, we do have two fractions on top, so we must simplify our numerator. So the first thing I recognize is that 5 and 15 are not the same common denominator, so I cannot add them as is. So if you don't know common denominator of 5 and 15, one of the strategies you can use is you can make a t-chart. We can put 5 on top and 15 on the bottom. And now we're going to list the multiples of 5. So 5 times 1 is 5, 5 times 2 is 10, 5 times 3 is 15. Oh, hey, look. 15 is a multiple of both. So we can turn this top fraction into common denominators of 15. So let's go ahead and do that. So to get 3/5 into 15s, we have to multiply it by 3. Notice I multiply both the top and bottom. 15 is already 15, so I don't have to change that fraction. So 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times 5 is 15. So now I have 9/15 plus 4/15. And that's still over 1/9. Okay, so now I can add 9 and 4 is 13. So 13/15 divided by 1/9. Cool, so now it looks like the last problem. So now we can write it in an easier form. Notice in this one there wasn't two fractions in the denominator, so I didn't have to simplify them. So all I have to do now is I can skip to 13/15 times, and then I'm going to flip 1 over 9, so it's 9 over 1. Now I'm ready to multiply, but wait, you know what I see? I see that I can cross-simplify. So cross-simplifying is just like when you simplify a fraction up and down, but you can simplify a fraction that's diagonal. So I noticed that both 15 and 9 are divisible by 3. So 9 divided by 3 is 3, and 15 divided by 3 is 5. So I'm going to turn this into the fraction 13/5 times 3 over 1. If you want to wait until the end and simplify, then that's okay too. But doing this step in the middle, I often find makes my math easier. So now I can solve. 13 times 3 is 39. 5 times 1 is 5. Okay, so now we have to answer the big question. Is this in simplest form? Most people say no, because it's not a mixed number. However, that's not what makes simplest form. Simplest form is simply when a fraction cannot be divided by any other common factors. This one cannot. So even though it's improper, we still leave it as is. And that is our answer in simplest form. Okay, so we got two more examples. So in this example, we don't have a multiple fractions on top, so our numerator is done. Our denominator isn't. So in our denominator, we need to create that t-chart again. So 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times 2 is 6. Oh, hey, that was simple. So my common denominator is 6. So I don't need to touch my top fraction. Let's just write that down. My bottom fraction, I can multiply by 2 over 2 to make it into 1/4 times 5/6 minus 8/6. Ooh, that doesn't look like 6. Let me erase that. 6. Okay, so I wrote kind of big. We're going to have to go to the next line. So on the next line, 5 minus 8 is negative 3/6. You know what? I know another name for negative 3/6. Negative 3/6 is actually just negative 1/2. So let's make that into negative 1/2. So that's going to be negative 1/2. So now we can write this as 1/4 divided by negative 1/2. which means we can keep, change, and flip. Okay, so now I can cross simplify. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So 1 times -1 is -1, and 2 times 1 is 2. So this fraction in simplest form is -1/2. Okay, last example. Notice in this example we have to simplify both the numerator and the denominator. So let's start on top. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw my t-chart. But wait, you know what I see? They're not adding or subtracting. They're multiplying. I don't need a common denominator when I multiply. All I have to do is top times top, so 7 times 1 is 7, and bottom times bottom. 8 times 2 is 16. Now I can move to the bottom. Let's do that in a different color. Oh. Actually, let's rewrite the problem. 2 7s plus 1/2. Okay, so that was the top. Top is done. Now we move to the bottom. And the bottom, you know, doesn't have a common denominator. And it's also adding. So we have to create one. So let's do one up here. So we have 2 and 7. So 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. Then we have 8, 10, 12, 14, and I'm out of room. So 7 times 1 is 7. 7 times 2 is 14. Oh, hey, look, I had the perfect amount of room. So the common denominator here is 14. So I'm going to have to multiply both fractions. So I'm going to multiply the fraction on the left by 2, the fraction on the right by 7. So this is going to give me 7/16 over 4/14 plus 7/14. See if we can squeeze one more fraction in on this line. So we're going to keep the 7/16. 4 plus 7 is 11/14. So now we're going to write it in an easier form. So 7/16 with my division sign, 11/14. So now I want to keep, so let's keep the first, change the division to multiplication, and flip this upside down. You know what I see? I see that we can cross simplify this and this are divisible by 2. So 14 divided by 2 is 7. 16 divided by 2 is 8. So let's see. 7 times 7 is 49. 8 times 11 is 88. There is no more common factors. So the answer is 49/88. I hope that you guys found this informative, and we'll see you next time.